Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Thank you to all for being here today. And I want to pick up the conversation with regard to the budget that Senator Mensch had begun. Secretary Thall, if I could. So in the governor's budget proposal on page B7, you and your team broke out the budget proposal for this year, which represents a 10.9% increase from last year. Yet in your forecast, you predict that the state's general fund spending would grow as follows. In the 23-24 fiscal year, general fund growth would be 0.27%. The growth in the 24-25 fiscal year, the stated budget is projected to be 1.38%. Then growth in that following fiscal year is 0.98%. And then finally in the 2026-27 fiscal year, it anticipates state spending would grow by 0.9%. I have to tell you, as I read those numbers, I just found myself questioning, when in the history of the Commonwealth have we had 4 straight fiscal years of spending growth under 1.4%?
So, as Senator Vogel pointed out, we're doing a number of things. Some of it shifting costs from the general fund, including the CHC. The actual spend over the 4 years after our budget year is actually, I believe it's $500 million more than was the actual general fund spend in the previous administration. So, our projections are just that, projections. We believe that they are sustainable over a period of time.
Can you help me understand how you account for under 1% growth over the next 3 years when I look at what our fuel prices are since the governor released this budget proposal? Fuel prices alone have grown 20% in a month. So when you look at inflationary pressures, and I started my career in public service as a school board director, and I innately know from that the cost of fuel for school buses. We fuel a lot of vehicles here in the Commonwealth, as I'm sure Secretary Topper can detail. The cost to heat buildings and electrify buildings and all those other things that we pay for. How can we account for that growth of being under 1%?
I mean, they're in the, that's what we see in the lines. I think there is, Senator Chairman Brown has many times said the budget is a snapshot in time. I'd like to give him kudos for his leadership on Act 120 of 2010, which, as you know, as the school board director, as we finally reached the peak, and so the increases in the pension lines for the schools are no longer the 4.5% that they have been, and hopefully with we can work with the system there to increase performance to get their to further lower their liability. But we think there's a, you know, looking at just the growth in the general fund misses the entire picture. We are confident that our growth levels of general fund budget are going to be close, if not exact, to what they are. There are another number of other funds within the budget that support the operations. The school pupil transportation line is something that is based on a formula that should reflect the price of gas when it is calculated, whenever that, I believe that's in October, but don't quote me to that. But the budget,
Relying on special funds to fund the growth in the budget.
right?
Is that?
No, I think we no more than other budgets have. The general fund budget is part of, you know, it's a large portion, and it's important because it's funded by our state tax revenues, but it is, we are confident that our general fund lines are funded appropriately in the out years. There are incidences where some general fund expenditures in the current year are taken over to other lines. CHC is an example, but we are confident that those are also adequately accounted for.
have to tell you that I respect you and what you and your team are doing, Mr. Secretary, but I would be hard-pressed to find anyone who supports this budget proposal would also be on board with limiting spending to less than 2% over the next 4 fiscal years, which is what this budget proposal figures. And I am very concerned, not just about what projected revenue would be, but just looking at my short but eventful tenure here in the Capitol, knowing the pressures that we're facing with inflation, I don't think that it's realistic to make that assumption. So thank you. Secretary Topper, if we could turn to a conversation that we had last year, you informed the committee, and I quote, that the vast majority of Commonwealth employees continue to go to work on site straight through the pandemic every day. And you noted that roughly 60,000 Commonwealth employees continue to work on site and that 20,000 state employees were teleworking. I believe that was the conversation that we had last year. And this was before the COVID vaccine was readily available. You set a goal of July 4th that the state would begin repopulating buildings and noted that and in your words, that the new normal will involve some degree of telework. And you said that telework represents a productivity tool for you. Your colleague, Secretary Hassel, explained to us just a few weeks ago that 44% of the employees at the Department of Revenue, they are working from home full-time, and another 25% are working part-time from home. So I think it begs the question of how are we tracking productivity of our Commonwealth employees? You know, there's all kinds of ways, I know, keystrokes and mouse movements or any other tools that ensure that the work of the Commonwealth is being done.
Sure. So thank you, Senator. So I can't speak for all of the agencies with respect to all the other agencies with respect to how they're managing their or tracking their own productivity, but I can speak to DGS and to the population, which continues to be just a minority of our department that is teleworking a substantial portion of time. The primary thing we focus on is an array of measures around cycle time. So I have a procurement department that has a responsibility for processing purchase orders and contracts. So we can easily track the numbers of purchase orders and contracts that are completed each month, and we have a baseline, and we're able to compare whether our productivity with respect to things like purchase orders and contracts are being processed at the same or better rate. The same is true within the Bureau of Real Estate when it comes to lease transactions, and in our Bureau of Vehicle Management when it comes to processing invoices associated with fleet maintenance. So what we try to do is focus on the material that's being processed and the speed at which we're processing it. We have not seen a significant drop-off in productivity. If anything, in parts of the agency where we have significant teleworking, we've seen productivity increase using those measures.
Okay. Very good. Last year, we also had a discussion about computer software licenses, and you explained that the contracts and the goal to get most employees back into offices, I think it was by last 4th of July, as I recall. And now that we know that most agencies will not have all of their employees return to the office full-time, can you share if your department and the Office of Administration have adjusted our software license agreements on workstations throughout the Commonwealth agencies?
So I don't know, but I'd be pleased to look into it and find out to what degree the Office of Administration and our procurement department have looked into the potential to renegotiate licensing agreements. Not all of the licensing. Many of the software packages that we use, involve a seat license, as opposed to a licensed resident on a specific machine. So the fact that we've moved employees, or employees have moved from a desktop to a laptop and are now working remotely ought not to have much of an impact at all on the actual cost of the license. But there may be instances where there are potential savings, and I think now that as things have evolved, and it's clear that we're going to be relying on telework, I think to a greater extent than we thought we might a year ago when we last spoke about this, I think it's certainly worth looking into.
Yeah, certainly if there could be potential savings with employees that are remote and potentially negating the need for those expensive software licenses on desktops that remain unused here in Harrisburg and across the Commonwealth, I think that would be something we would want to capture and would appreciate having that understanding. And I thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You mentioned software licenses and other costs. I just, we issued a press release yesterday. We just decided to do the math. And the Department of General Services over the last 7 years has contributed $613 million in savings to the bottom line for the Commonwealth. And that's because that team is incredibly aggressive. Most of it's procurement, and most of it is because that team is as aggressive as they are every day with respect to going after things like software agreements. Every master contract that we have in place undergoes pretty thorough scrutiny. We try at every renewal to try to pull cost out. And if anyone on the committee is interested in the details, we'd like nothing better than to walk you through the great work that team has been doing day in and day out.
Well, thank you very much for that update, and I can tell you that I look forward to continuing to work with you both on the Broadband Development Authority, and hopefully we can bring that same level of efficiency and effectiveness and fiscal responsibility to the federal taxpayer dollars that are coming into the Commonwealth for the purposes of connectivity. I thank you both very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.